So thank you very much for coming. Really, really appreciate it. This is our first attempt at a board game festival in this library, so it's really great to have had you and Shem Phillips earlier putting your mark of approval on it. Really appreciate that. And I'm just I'm excited. For those of you who don't know, Ian O'Toole has done a lot of graphic design for board games and has a partnership with the Portuguese designer Vital Lacerda, who's I've been discovering over the past year, actually. And in fact, if you head upstairs, we've got two of the display cases. We've got the Gallerist and Weather Machine laid out on display. Kind of cool. So with that in mind, though, rather than me kind of blather on, can you just give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and maybe tell us how you became, because I understand you're pretty much board game design exclusively now, and how that came about, what your studies were, background, and I'll just leave you to it.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. So yeah, my name's Ian O'Toole, and I'm a board game graphic designer and illustrator. I work exclusively in board games and have done for over 10 years now. I studied as a graphic designer in Ireland, and I worked for about 15 years in graphic design, doing corporate design and all the usual stuff that graphic designers do. I became a board gamer about 12 years ago, and kind of just chancing my arm, I emailed a few people around and see if I could do some work in board games because I thought it would be fun. And then a couple of kind of lucky chance encounters, one of which was my meeting with Vital Lacerda, happened, and that led to me doing a few games which were very well received, one of which is The Gallerist, which is on display. And from there, it's just grown and grown, and I never have had the need to do anything besides board games, because I've been very, very busy.
Do you find you get more requests than you can actually fulfill?
Yes.
Are you at the happy point of saying no, I can't help you?
Yes, I am. Yeah, which is great. It's lovely.
So was it because now you talk about the chance meetings with Vital Lacerda, but going down Board Game Geek, I noticed you've actually got you've got co-credits for art on some significantly older games as well, like Stevenson's Rocket and a few of those. So how did that come about? And was that kind of your initial foray into this?
Not really. I've done a fair few second editions and re-implementations and things like that, and I think that's just kind of a sign of a growing industry. I think as more and more people come into the hobby, these games that were really great and just the audience wasn't there when they were released are getting a new chance to shine. Some of them also had not as much attention given to the visuals on their first release. So, giving them a new coat of paint, sort of rethinking the components and things like that has been, there's the opportunities to do that now with just more people playing board games.
So that's actually interesting because this is a question I was going to ask later down the line, but since you've kind of alluded to it, can you talk about the process? We'll talk about your process with working with Vital and other artists, but how do you approach it differently when you're doing a reprint, be it Kanban EV? We have a copy of Rococo, for instance.
Right.
Or yes, how do you approach that differently? Do you kind of start over, so to speak, or do you think, okay, I have to honor what was there before but put my stamp on it? Or does that vary depending on the game?
It does depend on the game a little bit. Generally, it's usually easy to find if there's if people feel good about the original edition or not. You find people's opinions and see if they like it or not, if they want things changed or if they would prefer things kept the same. Rococo is a good example of a first edition that was well liked and from a very well liked artist, Michael Menzel. The first thing I always do is just play the games. I just play the original editions and sort of take notes on, where the sticking points are and what I think could be improved. And I'm also in the semi-unique position that I'm looking at it from a graphic design and an illustration perspective. So it's not only what can we make it look like, but is there a way that we can make it play better, make the gameplay smoother, that type of thing. And then to a lesser extent, there's a aspect of what can we do that wasn't done in the first edition. How can we, and often it's thematic, how can we bring out the theme a little bit more, whether that's through components or artwork or however we can do it in the presentation. Yeah, and other than that, it just really depends on the game. So some games need, like Stevenson's Rocket is a good example of a game that needed a whole sort of graphic design overhaul. Whereas something like Rococo doesn't need as much because again the first edition was pretty well thought out, so it was mostly just a visual overhaul.
So now going to working with another designer, whether Vital Lacerda or someone else, and maybe this varies. How much of a role do you play in the actual mechanics of the game, and how does the graphic design play into that? Are you given a set of instructions sometimes and say, I just need a board, or are you working on components and meeples and other things like that? Do you have a back and forth with the designer about the mechanics?
Yes, we do. So components wise, I work on everything that's in the box and the box. So I do all the components, all the color choices, sometimes like miniature sculpts and wooden meeple designs and all of that. Everything, if you go down and look at the Gallerist and the Weather Machine, everything that you see, I've designed. As regards the actual mechanisms of the game design itself, not a huge amount. I work with Vital Lacerda specifically a lot because we have a long-running partnership. So I tend to see his games when they're earlier in development. So I do give feedback, and sometimes things that I would like to do from a graphic design sense to make things easier will have an effect on his game design, but it's not something that I'm necessarily suggesting. It's just something that he thinks of, having seen what I've done. So I really don't affect the game mechanisms consciously, but sometimes it kind of happens through osmosis almost.
It's gonna sound like a funny question, but do you kind of have to like the game to feel like you can get the most out, or can you say, or maybe it's just like, I appreciate that people are really into this, not my thing, but I can still make good art for it. Or do you tend to choose projects that you think this is the type of game I'd be interested in playing?
Whether through luck or I don't know what, I actually have genuinely tended to like all of the games that I've worked on. I do look into the game itself before I accept the project. Often I'm excited to work with certain people or a certain theme or something like that, but I do read through the rules if they're available. I do play the game first. We usually play online these days on Tabletopia or Tabletop Simulator. So I go in with my eyes open, I guess is a good way to put it. It's not necessarily it's not a requirement that I love the game or that it's a game that's necessarily for me as a gamer. But I do like to at least think that it's a well-designed game. That's, if I'm going to put that much effort into it, I'd prefer if it's not a flash in the pan,
As for your own gameplay, do you have a particular style you gravitate towards? Are you, I'm guessing with Lacerda, you're a heavy Euro type of guy?
Yeah, I tend to be. My sort of bread and butter is probably a little lighter than that, probably in and around the Stefan Feld range, that sort of thing. But yes, that's sort of the spheres that I play in.
How important is color palette to your designs? And I was looking at some of the games I haven't played, but just looking through some of the stuff you've done in one Black Angel, for instance, which has got a very, very vibrant colors and complementary colors. And then you've got Weather Machine, which has this almost slightly sepia maybe that's not the right word, but almost faded look slightly to
Yeah.
it, and then
Yeah.
and then the color palette seems to change. And I'm wondering if you can just talk about your color choices and how you approach that.
Yeah, that's a that's a big topic. I love working
Sorry.
with color. No, that's fine. That's fine. Um, and again, a lot of these answers are going to be it depends, and it does depend. Black Angel is an example where the designers specifically came to me and asked to make a game that's set in space that doesn't look like a space game. So they didn't want it all black and blue, basically. Hence the strong magentas in that game, and when there is blue, but it's like cyan blue, like a bright blue. Um, color is really important with board games for a whole number of reasons. There's a lot of decisions to be made very early on about things like player colors and resource colors, and often they're the first color decisions that are made in any project. What are the player colors going to be, and what are the resource colors going to be? Because they're sort of functional demands of the game, and you do have to look at things like color blindness. And then from there, color plays a huge part in the readability of a game. So when you look at a board like Weather Machine or like the Gallerist, there's very conscious decisions made about colors, particularly when it comes to the iconography. Color will tie together certain elements of the game and help players recognize that this part's related to this because they're the same color. And it'll also help make things sort of pop off the board so players notice it more regularly. And also makes things recede into the background, which you'll see a lot in like Weather Machine. It's a very busy illustration, but the idea is that most of that, once you understand the gameplay, it's still decipherable.
When do you decide to make the board busier versus not so busy? I think there was one called Ride the Rails, which looked fairly clean, fairly basic.
Yeah.
I think it was hexes, if I remember. I can't remember exactly, but yeah. So what plays into that decision? Is it the game itself, or is it what the designer wants, or where do you arrive? When do you decide, right, this is going to get the Weather Machine look, and this is going to get the Ride the Rails look?
Yeah, a number of things. One can be budget, straight up, just how much they want to spend on it. Based, more detail, more art, costs more money. But that's usually not the deciding factor. Usually it's the audience that are going to play this game is what we're thinking of. And to an extent, how thematic the game is and how we want to push that theme in the case of Vital's games, and also to a little bit of an extent how long the game is. If you're going to be sitting in front of a board for 3+ hours, it's nice to have something to look at. Whereas if the game is an hour long, like in the case of Ride the Rails, it's not that much of a concern. Ride the Rails is part of a series called the Iron Rail series from Capstone Games, and all of those games are designed to be sort of an entry level into train games, which is a whole genre within itself, which is often called 18xx games, which I haven't worked in yet, but we're getting there. Those games have a very specific audience, and that audience typically does not appreciate heavily illustrated boards and things like that. So that's very much a concern going into design of that game. And I also worked on Age of Steam, which has a similar sort of minimalist aesthetic. So yeah, it's a mixture of all those things. Yeah.
Cool. And with that art as well, how much does the time period factor into it? And do you take linking Nemo's would be example, and then going back to Weather Machine, where the look looks very deliberately like artwork or illustration from that era or the supposed era. You talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, very much so. One of my favorite things is a game that's set in a historical time period or sort of inspired by a historical time period. Because it gives me the opportunity to dive into research and books and samples and things based on that time period or that specific place or both. I tend to jump around in illustration styles a lot. I don't really settle on one style too much. And part of that is because I love to do that so much, because I love to make games look like the time period in which they're set. So if you look at like Lisboa or Nemo's War or things like that, like I get really inspired by different historical styles and styles of design and construction and presentation, all that stuff I geek out about a lot. So.
And have you had any game project kind of along those lines that you thought this sounds really cool, but you found particularly challenging, or you kind of got into it and went, wow, did not expect that?
Oh, that's interesting. Along those, I mean, Nemo's War was just a lot. It's a lot of work. But almost because I love the game so much. So Nemo's War is one of the second editions that we talked about earlier. I was a big fan of the first edition. So much so that I actually approached them and said, "Can I work on the second edition?" And I'm a huge fan of sort of adventure illustration of that sort of era. So a lot of the illustrative touches in that game sort of came from me as opposed to the publisher asking for them. So the fact that every single ship token in that game is a separate illustration that's down to me. They're all researched, they're all real ships. Well, besides a couple of notable examples, they're mostly real ships that did exist. The Pequod is in there. And the fact that, each of the epilogues, for instance, at the end of the game, you get an epilogue that says how well or usually how terrible you did. Each of those has an illustration, which again, that wasn't in the brief. That's just something that I really wanted to do. So that didn't necessarily make it difficult. It just made it, I guess, more time consuming.
Hey,
Hey,
I was just
how you doing?
curious about sort of like the analog sort of creativity versus digital. Obviously, you're probably pretty competent with digital these days. Just
Right.
wondering about your journey 'cause when you started doing artwork as a kid or so. I'm guessing it would have been pencils, paint, and ink or whatever.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
how you've progressed through your career and how much that has a part to play still. Will you just go straight to a tablet and start drawing or what?
That's a really good question. Thank you. So using computers for digital artwork, like digital illustration specifically, because I did graphic design in school, which these days obviously is all digital. I didn't start using computers for illustration until I was working. So all the way through uni, I didn't do it. So I would have been maybe even 18, 19 thereabouts by the time I started using. So it's still a good. Well, my maths is bad, but a good while now. So these days my work is almost entirely digital. I do, except for this, just Sketchbook. I work out all of my games on a sketchbook first. So when I'm working on iconography, for instance, I'll go through everything. I'll just go to a different room, not my office. I'll go somewhere else, and I'll just sketch out all the icons. I'll read through the rule book, and I'll make notes on everything that's needed. I do all my board layouts as sketches. All my covers begin as thumbnail sketches. But from there, I go fairly directly to digital. The main reason for that is it's just so time consuming. It's so time consuming to do it by hand. I would dearly, dearly love to do an entire game completely as an analog game, but I have not had the opportunity to do that yet.
Everything that looks sort of like hand painted and everything, that's all done digitally.
Oh, yeah,
ultimately?
sort of. Yeah. Yes, ultimately it is.
Yeah.
I do purposefully put natural elements into all the textural work in the games and things like that. Like I will often do like brush marks and texture marks and stuff like that and use those elements. So there's definitely some handmade uh, parts of the game, but it's all constructed and put together digitally.
Also, you'd paint something and then from the real world and then scan it in and then sample that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, often or pen marks
Yeah.
or there's a couple of boards I've done where, for instance, there's like little illustrations for cities on a map, and each of those cities would be like a real pen drawing, for instance, and then photographed and scanned in. So there are elements, but the vast majority is still digital.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Tied to that, actually, since you talked about the fact you do all the designing of the actual physical components too, the meeples and characters and gears, so
Yeah.
what's your system for doing that? Do you have a wood shop downstairs? Do you actually cut these things out, laser cut them, just do 3D models of them and then send them off? What's the way you work?
So if it's wood, all that's required is an outline, which is just an outline, a vector outline, which I draw in Illustrator. I do use 3D software. I use Cinema 4D. I use that to visualize all my games. So as I'm actually doing the artwork for a game, I'll make a 3D model of it, and then as I finish each piece, I'll pop it in there, and then I get to see kind of how it looks with everything else in context. So I can make adjustments based on that. So I do model all of the components and I put them on the board virtually and move them around and make sure that works. That's about it. I mean, we have done some 3D printing prototyping and stuff like that from time to time, but that's only really needed if the pieces interlock in some sort of way or they need to physically work together, like CO2, for instance.
I was just gonna ask you about that.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So, you beat me to it.
Yeah. But yeah, mostly it's pretty simple outlines. I've also worked on some miniature work. I'm not a very accomplished 3D modeler. So for instance, I recently worked on a game called Voidfall, which has a lot of big spaceship designs and complicated things. So for that, what I would have done is concept drawings for the spaceships, which if you've seen concept drawings for I don't know, Star Wars. They're not as good as that, but certainly along those lines. And I would have done very simple rudimentary 3D models and then sent those to a proper sculptor to finish them off.
Oh, cool. Looking into this year, actually speaking of Voidfall, which I think is it's a release this year, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I was looking down at the list. You've got Blazon, Voidfall, Paradox Initiative, Pampero, Fit to Print. I think all had your name on them. You're a busy man.
Yeah.
And they're all quite diverse as well. You want to talk about a few of those? For those of you who don't know, I think Fit to Print's the one that's the journalists, right? The animal journalists, and then Pampero is about wind power in Argentina or Uruguay?
Uruguay. Yeah.
Uruguay, yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting diversity range of, if you can talk about a few of those and how you wound up in those projects and what your approach is.
Oh, okay. Where to start? Yeah, well, I wound up in I think all of or most of those projects by publishers just coming to me and asking me to work on them. And the diversity that you see is usually what attracts me to it if it's something I haven't done before. Blazon is a good example of that. I really like historical artwork, and that was entirely based on heraldry and things like that, which I really knew nothing about how heraldry works, and now I do, which is great. Pampero is a big heavy Euro game. That came to me through the designer. Julian Pombo is a designer who works with Vital Lacerda a lot. So he approached me because we had sort of crossed paths before with playtesting. And what was the other one? Fit to Print. Fit to Print. Flat Out Games came to me, which is slightly unusual because it's a light family game, and I don't often get approached for those. I tend to live in the sort of medium to heavy Euro area, which is exactly the reason why I wanted to do the project, because I like their games, and I just wanted to do something different. They were happy for me to slightly retheme that game. It was originally humans working in a newspaper, and we made it animals in a woodland setting and things like that. So yeah, it was a fun one to work on.
Was there some illustration inspiration for that? When I saw the cover, I kind of like things like Fantastic Mr. Fox came to my head, and children's books of that era. Was there some kind of inspiration, or is that just kind of because it's a fox?
No, a huge amount. I'm a huge fan of stop motion animation, and one of the things I really love from my childhood is the old Wind in the Willows stop motion animation. I'm also a huge fan of Watership Down and stuff like that. So yeah, that sort of style of comforting animal woodland illustration is very, very appealing to me.
Thank you for speaking to us all today.
Thank you.
One of my questions was, I hope you didn't answer it when I ducked out of the room, but around how long the process is from you getting engaged to you completing your design.
Wow.
It might differ. It might differ.
Yeah, hugely. Yeah. Anywhere, I mean, wow. Anywhere from 3 weeks to 4 years.
Oh, wow.
That's probably the shortest and the longest. Average would be probably about 4 to 5 months, maybe, from sort of inception to working on it. And that includes sort of playtesting, and then through to graphic design, through to playtesting again, through to finishing the artwork, and then like promotional material and final playtesting. There's lots of playtesting. Yeah, usually about 4 to 5 months would be sort of average.
Cool. And do you do that as sort of like a 9 to 5, or is it as inspiration strikes you?
No, certainly not. No. So for the last few years, I've been extremely busy. So I work a little bit more than 9 to 5. I tend to. Getting better at that. And I also, so as well as that, so 4 to 5 months is obviously not, well, not maybe not obviously, but it's not working solely on one game. I usually tend to work on about 4 to 5 at a time, sometimes upwards to 6, 7, 8 games at a time. 3 is comfortable. Just to put that in perspective. 3 is like a comfortable, I can wake up, work 9 to 5 and not stress out about it. 5 is usually sort of my operating, what I have been operating at for the last few years. So yeah, they tend to be a lot of work. The games that I work on tend to be a lot of work, and the bigger ones especially. They tend to be very complicated, and a lot of there's a lot of work that you don't necessarily see in the final game that has to be done. There's a lot of just working it out and thinking about it. And Pampero is a great example of that. Julian is an incredible designer, but it's also his first game. So there's a lot of stuff that he didn't know about in regards how rules need to be expressed and all this sort of stuff. And a lot of that's just very complicated systems and working out all that sort of stuff, none of which, we've had 4-hour Zoom meetings where we just go through every single icon in the game and work out all the possibilities of what it could mean. So yeah, it's complicated work.
So on that sort of matter, what are the parameters? Like, do people come to you saying, I want a game and I want it to have here's my rules, but I want it to have meeples specifically, or I want it to have tokens specifically? Do you have sort of like a manufacturing endpoint built in from the get-go, or do you develop that?
I usually do in conjunction with the publisher, because
Mhm.
sometimes it's a budgetary concern, sometimes it's like an audience. Is it going to Kickstarter, for instance?
Mhm.
I.e., does it need to be a little bit fancier? Some designers have strong thoughts on components. You'll notice that Vital doesn't have any plastic in his games.
Okay. Yeah.
Things like that. I also do, but you know, I will enforce that sometimes, but not often. So it really depends. It always comes from a discussion with the publisher or the designer, depending on who I'm working with directly. About it usually comes down to what is appropriate, like what feels right, what
Yeah.
feels like it's the right component, what sits with the theme, what's not going to get in the way or create, or a big thing these days is what's not going to make the game overly expensive for the type of game that it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty common these days that people want to put in, you know, plastic miniatures and everything and make everything deluxe and screen print everything. But if it's a small game that is half an hour, you might not want to spend $100 on it, right?
Totally.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I have just kind of a last question, and thank you so
Mhm.
much again. I wrote this down, and I think this actually came out from another interview I had done. And when you're looking at a theme, and the term visual hook came out, and I think you may have used that. And can you explain that a little bit and how that applies to your design decisions?
Yeah. Can I? I don't know if I did mention that term but I have used it before. To me, what I usually mean when I say that is for my own purposes. So when I start to work on a game, I do a bunch of research and I try and find an angle basically into that game. And that's what I would usually refer to as a visual hook, just something that makes me go, oh, that's the approach. That's what we should be doing. A good example of that is the Azulejo tiles, those blue illustrated tiles from Lisboa. Finding that immediately was, you know, that's the identity of this game. That's what it needs to look like. Rococo is a good example. As much as the first edition is beautifully illustrated, it doesn't really look like Rococo, like the style of Rococo, the historical period. So once we realized that, it was, well, let's lean hard into the actual style of Rococo. So yeah, that would be, I think, what I possibly meant when I said visual hook.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful having you, and thanks everybody.